I'm Lawrence Woodward. I'm down on the programme as Organic Research Centre, which is true enough in that my entire life since 1980 was involved with organic agriculture, most of that time as co-founder and director of what was then called Elm Farm Research Centre and is now called Organic Research Centre Elm Farm. However, although I'm still involved with projects with Elm Farm, I'm involved in a number of other projects which I could also be down here as. One is a thing called Whole Organic Plus, which is differentiating between, should we say, corporate organic and going back to organic and principles as defined by the International Organic Movement. Another is educating people about genetic engineering. And a third project involves training farmers in approaches to health and the use of homeopathy, which the Prince mentions in his book Harmony as one of the things which indicates how harmony can be brought into management systems on farms. The Prince also, as you know, in his book talks a lot about his experiences in organic farming. And I first met the Prince in 1982, when he began his journey or his investigation on organic farming. And I was involved in the first, or drawing up, the conversion plan for the first bits of land at Highgrove, at Tetbury. In those days, the Prince faced a lot of opposition from his so-called advisors and land agents, and we were allowed to experiment on 82 acres, which is actually a large block of land. Its defining characteristic was it was down a narrow track covered by hedgerows and couldn't be seen from the road or many other places because they all thought it wasn't going to work. This actually is the relevance of this today is when we developed the conversion plan for that, and we were the ones who were introducing the idea of conversion planning into what sometimes had been a haphazard process, introducing conversion planning into the business of transitioning, as it's now called, from conventional to organic, we had this idea of a whole farming system, a system that worked together. Now, there are farms of 82 acres or less that are whole farming systems and can be managed as a whole farm. There's no real reason why 2 acres can't be, or 102 or 1,002 or whatever. But it does raise the question, which is one of the questions here, the farm as an ecosystem. So it raises the actually, what do we mean by farm? What actually happened at Highgrove was that 82 acres was managed as something completely separate to everything else that was happening within that management unit that they call the farm. And the painful lesson was that they couldn't manage it like that. So fortunately, the decision was taken eventually to convert all of the rest. The 82-acre block, despite the fact that we had a proper rotation and developed nutrient cycles and so on, didn't really work as a self-sustaining holistic entity. It wasn't really a farm. Now, I'm not sure whether that was because we weren't managing it as an organism, as an ecosystem, or could we have done it another way? So when we talk about the farm as an ecosystem, this begs the question, what is a farm? Then, actually, what is an ecosystem? The term ecosystem was only coined in 1935. It's the first time it ever appears anywhere in anyone's literature. And it was defined as a community of living organisms crudely with the environment. And after that, it was developed. But before that, people in the organic movement, particularly, for example, the biodynamic movement, didn't refer to ecosystems, but they referred to whole organisms. They managed their farms as whole organisms. So is a farm an organism? Is that different from an ecosystem? And these are relevant in terms of discussing farms as ecosystems or farms within this harmony principles. the hidden assumption, which is not really brought out, is that there is an organism, there is a self-organizing mechanism, the Prince referred to that this morning, self-organizing principles that allow farms to function as an ecosystem or entities to function, and that kind of functioning can be found everywhere in nature. It's a lot of assumptions, and some of those things we're actually going to explore in a few moments. But I was just told I need to raise these questions. The other thing leads to the question of farm and ecosystem and holism, leads to the question of scope. What is the scope of a farm? What is the scope of an ecosystem? What is the scope of a whole entity? The definition of holism from the beginning, going back to the Encyclopedia Britannica, would you believe, 1926, defines holism as the functioning of whole organisms with boundaries, with scope, but in relationship to other discrete organisms. So what does that mean? We misuse the term holistic these days. I use the term holism now with the W on, W-H-O-L-E, because I'm fed up with people who use the term H-O-L-I, whatever it is, because that's branding. This now means branding. You can have holistic shampoo, holistic toenails, holistic cosmetics, holistic God knows what. That doesn't seem to me to be the same as whole entities. And what we have to do, if those whole entities, whether ecosystems or not, we're managing those things in a different way, that's different between holistic branding. And this leads us to a critical question in terms of farms, because if we have these principles and these dynamics, where does it fit in the real world where farmers are under pressure to increase productivity? And the pressure to increase productivity often leads to shortcuts, to our making compromises with some of the things that the Prince says are inviolable, non-negotiable principles that we find everywhere in nature. And those are the kinds of things that you can look at in the abstract, you can do philosophy on it, you can do it in a kind of arty-farty, airy-fairy way, but a farmer, a grower, gardener, is faced with those conflicts and those dilemmas constantly in part of their ongoing management.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Lawrence, for the introduction. We have got a very short period of time, but one thing I want to tell you before I start, which I'm going to just pinch from my wife here. 10 years ago, she bought me a book at Christmas. I get so many books at Christmas from Celine, and it's fantastic, and my bookshelves are absolutely chock-a-block with books. They're nearly all something to do with farming. But anyway, this one particular book gathered dust for a long time, and it was on the bookshelf. And then she kept saying to me, it's a really good book, you should read it. It just contains so much fabulous information. And I kept saying, yeah, but there's all these other books to read, and I'll get it. She said, no, you must read it. So I didn't read it. 10 years on the bookshelf. Patrick Holden came on the phone and said, Ian, I want you to cover this subject called harmony. Yeah. Well, it's about a book. So here we are. We've all got our own stories as to how we got here, but that's sort of mine. And I have read the book, and it is really interesting. But what I want to talk to you about now is most of you will know me for the work that I've done since I left college, agricultural college, which has been in seeds. But I want to tell you my experience as a farmer, because I was really fortunate, and my group of people that I work with, we've had a degree of success over the years, and it got to the point where we were able to hopefully now do something with the success that we'd built. And so when a while ago an opportunity came up in the Cotswolds to buy a farm, we decided that we would take it. And so we bought ourselves a very small farm, relatively speaking. It's a farm that is slightly smaller than average, but it's on sufficient scale. It's just over 100 acres, sufficient scale to use and tell this story. So Honeydale Farm has been a farm for a long time, and I'll just tell you a little bit about it just to set the scene, and I want to describe its ecosystems. It's really important. So this is Honeydale Farm on the screen now. It's contained within the yellow box, so you can see quite clearly it's a beautifully square farm with the farm buildings right in the centre of it, as how many farms were originally. But you'll notice one or two things really quickly. One is that it's half of the ground is cultivated, the top half effectively, and it does fall down to the river in the bottom. where the blue line is, and that's the River Evenlode, which goes eventually to 15 million people in the Thames Valley. So anything we do on this farm, and anything the farmers do upstream of London has an effect on people's ecosystems in London. So for me, the ecosystem is about soil, it's about the plants, about the animals, about the water, the whole total environment of that farm. And you can see very quickly that it is, it affects a lot of different things. So when we went to the farm originally, all that cultivated land I showed you, that was 60 acres of spring barley, and that had been monoculture for decades. And that's a farming system that evolved over many years, as many of us have been involved with. But the monoculture system really doesn't offer us much in the way of ecosystem. It offers us virtually nothing, in fact. At least that was our experience. So we carried on with this system for a while. And here's my wife again, actually at this stage looking quite impressed with my abilities. So he may not have read the book, but he did at least get out there and do a bit of farming. And this was our first crop, which was exactly the same as the previous farmer had grown for decades. So we decided not to change anything, but to monitor the farm for 12 months to see what it was all about in its present form. We were advised to do this by so many of our good friends. So we grew a fantastic crop of spring barley. It looked really nice. But when you come to the maths, it doesn't stack up. And this is the monetary value that we got from our barley. We grew a really nice crop on the Cotswolds. It was perfect. We got a good yield. We sold it with a malting barley premium, which means we got paid more, but it still lost money. Well, we deal with a lot of farmers. I think there's 15,000 farmers at the moment, and most farmers would agree that there's an awful lot of marginal crops like this. And when you're not making any money on a farm, it's really difficult to see how it's sustainable. So we went to basic principles at the farm. We decided we would start with the soil. With the work we've done, we know how important the soil is, we know how important the crops are in relation to the soil, and that effectively that will deliver everything else down the road. But it's long term. This is not something that we can think about changing overnight. So we decided that we would start with a conventional lay farming system, bearing in mind that this farm was really monoculture spring barley. We completely changed the emphasis to grow our own fertility by using deep-rooting grasses, clovers, and herbs. And this is what it looks like, in terms of the plants that we use. So at least half of our crop rotation, and there is one, is growing these deep-rooting plants. And these plants harness natural systems. There's nothing new about any of this. This is just reinventing the role for these plants. So the legumes, the flowering legumes, are fixing nitrogen, and they can fix more nitrogen. As Ellen McCarthy said this morning, 80% of the stuff that goes into urban areas could come out as fertilizer. Great, fantastic, let's do that. But this stuff is already happening. We can make available more nitrogen than we need through plant growth, and we can make available also phosphates. So I don't see why we can't use this natural system. The other thing that I would stress about this particular image is the way in which the plants are arranged. This isn't monoculture where everything is the same. We want massive diversity, not only in the plant species, but within the way in which they grow through the year. So in this case, with a lay farming system, we don't want all our crop to be ripe on the same day, ready for the combine harvester. We want plants to be growing early in the spring, we want them to be growing in the middle of the summer and late in the autumn, so that we're fully utilising the eternal sunlight that so that we can get maximum plant growth. We also, in our case, have sheep on the farm, and that makes the picture complete as far as I'm concerned, because crop production in isolation doesn't really seem to cut the mustard for me, not in terms of soil fertility. Every farm is different, as I think a number of speakers have said this morning, and I would totally concur with that. But where you have the opportunity to lose livestock in the system, you bring the fertility. Again, there's nothing new about these systems. What you do with the livestock is another question. But my point is, when you follow these animals around, you look at the soil and you look at the environment which they're creating, with insects particularly, you see this huge ecosystem evolving around plants, the livestock, and the things that they bring. This is what our sheep look like. We work with a neighbouring farmer. We host these sheep. This is his son's sheep. So there's two generations of farmer involved. We, myself and my wife and other people involved on our farm, move these sheep on a daily basis on a mob grazing system. I'm not recommending a mob grazing system to everyone. For us, it works really well because we believe we can build soil fertility more quickly that way. We also grow plants just purely to improve the soil. This is a crop of mustard, which is a monoculture mustard. And it's brilliant in some respects. It's a load of green material, very easy to grow, very cheap to grow, and it's ploughed back into the soil. But why do we want to stop there? This is what traditional or modern conventional agriculture has taught us. Just grow one single crop, it's easy, because you can control the weeds in that with a herbicide. But when we grow stuff like this slide shows you, oops, hang on. I've actually, forgive me, I've skipped one. Can I just go back one, please? Yeah. So this is growing oats, so forgive me. This is growing oats, and with a monoculture oat, which we grow, or we grow the oats, we undersow it with an intercrop, which is in this case a legume. And this clover is fixing nitrogen whilst the oats are growing. And it's not a particularly difficult technique, it's not a particularly new one, but when it works really well, like this next slide will show you, it is building soil fertility. So there's a huge amount of nitrogen being fixed into the soil, free of charge. This is suppressing weeds. We get very few weeds in our crops when we've got an undersown legume, so we don't need herbicides. That's economically sensible. And the sheep can graze this. So it has multiple uses. We're still growing the corn crop, is what I'm saying. So going back to the mustard, here's our monoculture mustard, which is what I was taught to do when I was at agricultural college. Grow mustard, it's a green manure, that's what you do. But mustard in isolation is missing a few tricks. And if we look at the next slide, you'll see that there's loads to be had from growing more species in the same space. Because for green crops particularly that are ploughed back into the soil, it's a very old farming technique, you can use multiple species, you can fix nitrogen, you can add huge amounts of organic matter, you can provide for insects, you can provide for farmland birds. We allow ours to seed for the birds. We put this into rotation so that the birds, this is our bird seed plot. We don't confine our bird seed plots to the outside of the fields. Thanks very much. So our bird numbers in 3 years have gone from 44 to 77. Sorry, 74. The merlin has come because there are little brown birds to eat. You know, this is a system, this is an ecosystem that works really, really well. We also have plants on our farm that are really well adapted to their environment. This is a plant called sandfoin. The sandfoin plants we have are not uniform. They're part of a landrace selection which has been evolved over many, many years. So these plants are unlike a crop of wheat that has exactly the same genetic makeup and is expressed the same. These don't. These express themselves differently depending on their environment, which we can harness. It's really, really important longer term. The sandfoin looks like this. It's a fabulous crop. This is the dog in a show-stopping crop which we grew this year. And the next slide shows you that we baled it for hay. We had over 1,000 bales of hay off 9 acres. It was the heaviest yielding crop on our farm. Now, I'm not suggesting that sandfoin is the heaviest yielding crop, but it was on our farm. We recognised it and we grew it specifically because it suited the environment and it was really useful. It also is fabulous for bees. We have loads of bees on our farm, both wild native bees, bumblebees, and also honeybees. And our farm has created an ecosystem not just for the farmland, the obvious things, but also for people. These are our beekeepers. These are not full-time. One of our beekeepers here is a mentor, and the other is a beekeeper who works in my office in the seed business. We also have fruit trees. The bees pollinate the fruit trees, of course. We've planted a living library of Oxfordshire varieties, 250 varieties, which we did with the local community. And we are hoping the local community will come back in 10 years and harvest the fruit. Richard's laughing. I don't think that's a pipe dream at all. I genuinely believe that's what we're going to achieve because I think they're bought into the system. Well, he's laughing at my times. Oh, sorry. And finally, no, sorry, Richard, forgive me. And finally, because I know time, Lawrence, is ticking away, water wasn't on our farm when we arrived. It was going straight down the ditches into the river I showed you at the beginning. So we took a little bit of money from the National Lottery Fund, £7,000, and we created a natural flood management scheme. We have now got, as a result of that, wetland birds on the farm, loads of dragonflies, everybody likes it, including the duck, and this is our farm now. So from that monoculture farm we had right at the beginning, this is how we've ended up. It's a patchwork quilt. I wish it was a little bit more permaculture. I wish it was a little bit more rounded. That's what we've been able to achieve with machinery. There are more crops than I could name. I'd need another 10 minutes, which I won't take. But I believe that is a potential farm of the future that we've created. It's not for everyone. Everyone's will be different. But it is doable. We've done that in 3 years' time. In 3 years, I should say. And I think it's possible. And so finally, that is my vision. Of course, I have to have a little plug for the seed because that's the beginning of this whole system. But this ecosystem is very creatable. Thanks.
Okay, I'm the only one of the four who's not a farmer, but I have spent a few months short of 50 years working in the poorest countries of the world in agriculture, and I hope I can bring a sort of global perspective to this. And I've been asked to talk about the role of pasture and its importance and its value. So, next one. So there's our precious earth. That's where we start. Next one. And you can see that basically 2/3 is water, 1/3 is land. Of that, 1/3 is farmed. Of that 1/3, 2/3 is pasture. So 9% of the world's surface is pasture. It is farmed, and a third of that is pasture. So just to make it global, take us away from Wales, that is in Sudan. Right, next one. Okay, so this is a report produced by UNEP. And I've just taken some bullet points out of here just to sort of see the relevance. 5 billion hectares, 1 billion people dependent, what they call a closed system powered by renewable solar energy. You can read this, smaller water footprint. It holds 1/3 of global terrestrial stocks of carbon dioxide, it sequesters carbon, maintains diversity, it's more productive per unit of land than intensive systems. And the tragedy is most of these benefits go unmeasured, which is why they're not reflected in so much of the policy around the world. We come to the UK. 2/3 of UK farmland is also pasture, which protects the soil. I'm a great fan of Wendell Berry, and the soil is the skin of the earth is his phrase. Well, maybe we could say that pasture is the skin of the soil. Pasture is the UK's largest solar panel, and of course it takes carbon out of the atmosphere. Next. Pasture is a sponge. 60% of the nation's water is held in the uplands, in the pastures there. The role of pasture in generating and holding organic matter will not be new to you. That's rather a wonderful picture of a grass plant here. And I've nicked this from Ian, but again, you saw that just now, but the amazing diversity of plants and how together they build soil fertility. This is permanent meadow on Ian Boyd's farm on 4 inches of Cotswold soil. This is a permanent meadow, and we go to the next one, and this is a ley. That ley is 18 months old, as you can see, planted under barley in spring 2004, photograph taken 18 months later after a hay crop. So the benefits are back in biodiversity, bringing benefits, rooting depth, symbiotic, all the things that Ian was talking about just now, and the health of the animals, because what we eat, what we are, what we eat, and therefore, if you look, the yellow on the left is the animals raised on pasture, and the brown is animals raised on concentrate. And this is omega-3 and linoleic acid and so on. You can see the benefits reflected in the produce from animals that are raised on pasture. Thank you. And finally, pasture provides natural diet for ruminants, and I think very importantly, a welcoming home for manure, because so much of the industrial system, manure becomes excrement, becomes a problem, and manure is in balance. And so the animals have a natural stressed environment. So I want to go to New Zealand now, which is the sort of mecca of dairying. And there you can see there are as many cows as there are people, and these cows produce roughly 4 tons of milk each. But over the last 25 years, due to irrigation, use of nitrogen, and now the introduction of palm kernel cake from Indonesia, you'll see that 90% of New Zealand's monitored lowland rivers are no longer fit for swimming, due to fecal contamination, so on. 3/4 of native freshwater fish are threatened, and this is a direct quote from the government's environmental report. The high and still rising use of synthetic nitrogen appears to be leading to farming systems that are financially and environmentally brittle. So that's a government report. So pasture per se can be abused in the way that it is in parts of New Zealand. Okay, next one. So now we're going to go to India, where I spent the last 5 years working. And there you are, you can see your Channel Line breeds. You've got 75 million dairy farmers there. A third of the world's dairy cows are there, producing much less. And you've got 60,000 co-ops, dairy co-ops. On the right, on the wall, you can see the manure that used to be dried and burnt now increasingly goes through a biogas digester to produce gas so people can cook their meal on there. Then the spent manure with all its nutrients goes back onto the land. Yep. Sorry, that just so you'd like to see that one. But that's just show their other cows. Whenever I went around the villages, I always had to be photographed with people's cows. So next one. So on the left, that's beer seam, a legume crop. Beer seam and grass and other things are brought in. It's chopped up, fed to the cows together with crop residues. Next one. And then it goes, those of you my age will remember the churns. Every litre is valued. It goes through this system. It's consolidated. It's tested. It goes to a typical collection centre, and then the empties go back. Health and safety would have a fit. But it then goes back through the system to the farms. And then we end up, that processing plant is owned by the cooperatives. It's owned by the farmers. And then you go into a shopping mall in the middle of Delhi, and there are women bringing their cans and getting the milk. Now, the great thing about that system is that it's, the income generated there now flows back down through the 60,000 cooperatives to those farmers. So we've got an ecosystem and we've got a socio-economic system. It's not perfect, but it's under threat. And it's under threat by things like trade deals from the UK, trade deals from the US, venture capital, fertilizer companies, who the politicians and the private interests can't allow the inmates to run the asylum. They want to own it, they want to. So this is seriously under threat. But that just shows what the potential is. Next one. Okay, well, you don't need to see that. This just summarizes the sort of biodiverse pastures and so on. So let's go to the next one. Because when we start looking at an ecosystem, why it doesn't work, there are various reasons we can come to. But one of them is vested interests. Now, this graph here, if you look along the bottom, is 1947 to 2000 in Canada. The black line is farm gross income, the bottom line is farm net income. Along the bottom line, you've got the introduction of tractors, four-wheel drive tractors, 2,4-D, fertilizers, glyphosate, GM. All these high-tech things have been introduced, but you can see that whereas gross income's gone down, net income as net income has gone down. And that money has gone down to these guys down here, and those are the vested interests that we have to counter when we're trying to achieve change in our system.
2 minutes, John.
Yes, I'm nearly finished. I just love this cartoon. It just, to me, it says everything. Sun-free, rain-free, grass-free, poop-free, healthy soil, carbon, biodiversity. Now, this is about more than just farming. This conference is about culture and spirituality. And for the last 15 months, I've been supporting a poet to go around some pasture farms in the UK, and they've been hosted by our farmers, a guy called Adam Horowitz, and his book will be coming out at the end of this year called The Soil Never Sleeps. But I just thought I'd like to read one of his poems to finish. You know, it's Seamus Heaney who said, "We are a culture first and an economy second." This is the poem written in Kent on a farm, February 2017. Cattle come running to the hum of the quad bike, the promise of hay sweeter than this tired winter grass. Here at the top of the field, in the cold rise above the farm, where the wind sits heavy on the sunshine, grass grips close to soil. Brambles flail over the fence lip. Cones of bracken are pressed into oblivion by eager hooves. We have lured the bullocks here away from the softer curves of the farm's lower reaches. The hay hurled from the trailer is a bribe for their trampling, a tribute. No weed killer here. The land manages itself under the pressure of hooves, despite the old spaniel with a mucky eye, keen to guard the bracken, barking and fainting rash challenges to the cows as they rip hay apart with limber tongues, test their nascent horns brother on brother in glass-eyed hunger games. Today they are grass-starved demigods, those bullocks manoeuvred and conditioned by greed into keeping down stray weeds. All that spoils the pasture corrupts the soil. And the last slide. So there we have it. The care of the earth is our most ancient and most worthy and pleasing responsibility. Wendell-Berry, and pasture has a role to play in that. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk to you very briefly about three things today in the hope that we can stimulate some conversation around them. The first is just to give you a brief sense of the trials and tribulations as a practical farmer. I'm a farmer myself in Wiltshire, as well as CEO of the Soil Association. So the trials and tribulations of actually doing it. I'm secondly going to talk for a moment about, is it right anyway? Are farms really islands in the way that sometimes that question suggests? And thirdly, I just want to raise a question, because it's all about questions here today, which is an increasingly big one for me. Does the ecosystem in the end become the farm? I just want us to try and look at things the other way through. So, my own farm, briefly. I farm about 1,500 acres, a long, thin strip of land from the top of the Marlborough Downs down into the Vale of the White Horse. We have lots of different soils and lots of different geographies through that 5-mile strip of land. And we have all the things you'd expect, I suppose, from any self-respecting organic farm. We have a balance of fertility generating and fertility using crops. We have a balance of livestock of different types: sheep, dairy cows, beef, pigs, a few chickens even now, so that we have clean grazing systems and largely disease-free herds. We have a balance of people and skills to run all of those enterprises, those crops and those livestock. And we've got pretty much all the machines and the resources to do all the things that we need to do, from repairing machines to cutting our hedges within our own farming business. And over time, we've tried to balance things up a bit more by creating some of the habitats that were lacking on the farm. So we've planted woodlands, and we've recreated the chalk downland that was so appallingly destroyed after the war. Something like 96% of our chalk downland is gone. We've got a little bit of it back again. And we've tried over time to feed our local community as far as possible. The way of the world, our business didn't develop in the way that we initially hoped it would. We ended up feeding people all over the place, including in other countries. But over the last 10 years, we've tried to relocalize a lot of our food business, feeding people through our own pub and more locally. And we're even now working with some Italians, making mozzarella on the farm, so that the whey from that mozzarella, which comes from our own milk, can go back to our pigs, one of those kind of age-old cycles. So that all sounds okay, but actually, and it has been helpful. I think all of this thinking is really helpful in pushing back against specialization, which is a scourge of our time, and helping farmers think more and more about the resources they've got on their own farm, rather than constantly buying it in inputs. But at the same time, it is still deeply flawed. And it's deeply flawed for a number of reasons, partly because of the system that we're operating within. It is impossible today to return the waste from the people who are eating our food back to that land, certainly within organic systems. It's very hard to feed people, to feed your local community directly, when we don't even have the infrastructure like abattoirs and processing opportunities to do that without us all having to capitalize our farms beyond sensible levels. And we're not yet, most of us, tackling the energy issue on our farms either. Those are just 3 examples of how we're trying to think of our farm as an ecosystem within a flawed world. But it's also impossibly difficult because we are not very good as farmers, as people, at managing the degree of complexity that this kind of system requires. And we still struggle to find the people who have both the values and get this stuff, but are also practically competent to run these kind of complex systems. Maybe we can come back to that a bit later. So it's tricky. And I would also question whether it's fully desirable, because no farm is an island, and nor should it be. And as Lawrence said at the beginning, what is a farm anyway? It's an arbitrary unit of ownership or stewardship. Post-Lawton, we know that to secure our biodiversity, we need to be connecting up our landscape, not dividing it into little ecosystems. We must start to think beyond the unit of the farm if we're going to be managing our landscape in a way that is going to allow species to spread and thrive, to allow genetic flow through our landscapes, to manage our water on a catchment level rather than just thinking about it as at the farm level. And I hope that in the future some of our new policy incentives post-Brexit, if we get that far, will incentivize that kind of landscape thinking rather than just focusing on the unit of the farm. And furthermore, I think one of the only ways that our farmers are going to survive in the longer term is for them to start to share and collaborate and work across their boundaries, whether that's sharing machinery or labor or marketing together, as well as actually improving the ecosystem through thinking beyond their farm gate. But my final question today, and I wouldn't normally share this these days, but is to think about whether our addiction, our obsession with farming needs to end. Because I sometimes wonder whether it's actually about the ecosystem becoming the farm. Whether we need to start thinking about how do we harvest nature rather than constantly intervene and try and subject nature to our idea of how we want it to be. And that's a question I might just leave you with for a moment. Interesting. I mean, I've been long interested in some of the ideas like permaculture, where instead of constantly ploughing and sowing and reaping and all the rotational farming that we do, whether we can develop more permanent systems of farming. I've got very involved over the last year or two in agroforestry and trying to develop a system which is more productive per acre, but by capturing light from all sorts of levels, looking at productive trees like nuts and fruits and integrating that with our pasture land or with our cropping. That's a kind of step in that direction. But I am really interested, when you look at how, and none of this stuff is ever static. I worry slightly from our conversation this morning that we think of harmony as a point we get to and then we hold it there. Of course, everything is dynamic all of the time. Nature is dynamic all of the time. But how do we, are there ways in which we could be harvesting nature better? I mean, I look at my farm at the moment, and there must be 50 tons of rabbits running around the place, all of which need harvesting. And there are a lot of deer, and there are a lot of squirrels. There's a lot of wild meat that we're just not making use of. When you look at the plants we call weeds, and actually understand that we could be eating them. You know, there are, whether it's cleavers or chickweed or nettles, I mean, all of these are, we have narrowed our dietary range down to very few crops that we then disturb nature massively by growing. Could we not be using all of those crops? I know that the logistics of doing it are very difficult, and there are some challenges in terms of markets and, you know, manufacturing. But I'd just like us to kind of push the boundaries of what's possible in terms of taking a more natural system or taking what nature gives us a bit more and making better use of it rather than constantly trying to intervene and put our mark on the land. So it's just kind of a question as we're in spirits of questions.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to talk about something I've never spoken about before, so it's not going to be as fluid as the previous presentations, but I'm just going to make some comments about humans within farm ecosystems, because actually there would be no farms without humans. And if we think back to our earlier ancestors who first made the transition from hunter-gatherers to farming land 5,000 or 8,000 years ago, sometime after the last ice age. That has led, in a series of stages, to the farms we have today. Initially, the farmers who tilled the soil could only grow as much as they could actually cultivate, probably by hand, and then they started harvesting animals to harnessing animals to increase their capacity. And we now have some farms somewhere in parts of the world with tractors with 500 horsepower, so that one person can be doing a huge amount of work in a very small amount of time. And that's led to all the wonderful things that we've got as a society. It's led to culture and art, and it's led to people having a wide range of foods to eat. And it's allowed specialisation in a wide range of areas. But it's also led, of course, to all the things that people have already spoken about, to degradation and species loss and climate change and so on. And so I think, one could say, has it been a good thing, actually, our species becoming farmers? And that's really a subject for another event, not this one. But we do have to bear in mind that there are some very negative aspects. However, the one I'd just like to raise is that nobody else, I think, is actually going to mention this conference. It's also led to overpopulation. And for me, that's one of the sort of elephants in the room that we haven't addressed in this conference. And because unless we can get our own fertility in harmony with our ability to produce food, then we don't have a terribly harmonious future. And this might seem rather outrageous, and forgive me for that, but I don't personally think that sexual intercourse will go out of fashion when we get to 9 or 10 or 11 billion people on the planet. So that the problems are likely to get worse rather than better, unless we're very, very careful. However, we are where we are, and we've got to do what we can to address the problems. And so what I want to do now really is just rattle through a list of issues which I feel need to be addressed and things we should be thinking about. And one of the problems, when I was born, I started on my grandfather's farm, and from 1953 my father had a 39-acre smallholding where he mowed 41 acres on 39 acres, very intensive, no alternative really, and he managed to bring us up as a family, and that was enough as a farm to be viable then. Today it would not be a viable model. Even a farm 3 or 4 times that size is barely viable. And why has that happened? Well, really it's because food prices have come down in real terms, and politicians and many people will believe that's been a huge success of society and of agriculture, that we've been able to produce so much more food, so much more economically, and bring down the cost of food in real terms. But because population has increased, rents have gone up, mortgages have gone up, people are spending their extra money on additional holidays, searching for something which they can't find at home because we've destroyed so much of our local environment that we go looking for things in other parts of the world rather than trying to put our own backyard right. And so have we really gained? We really gained very much by the fact that food in real terms is roughly half as expensive today as it was in the 1950s. I don't think so, personally. How do we look at the fact, what is it that's actually caused that to happen? We can talk about things like producer supermarkets coming in the 1960s. Well, the first one I went into was 1966. I'm sure there must have been some around before that. It has a big impact, though. I think also people no longer value food, not so much in financial terms, but because it's so readily available. They don't have to sweat unless you've got an allotment or something like that. It's very, very easy going through an Aladdin's cave of a supermarket, and it's all there for you to help yourself to. That's perhaps due to this whole issue of the separation of producers and consumers. I'd say when I was a child, there would be very few people that I encountered who didn't have someone in the family who had direct connections with farming. A parent, a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle, some sort of relation like that. Today, I think the vast majority of people in the in the population do not have that connection with agriculture, and as a result, it's hardly surprising that they are distanced from it. And that's, of course, what a large number of industries have tried to achieve. Historically, you know, it was just grow your own, but now each farmer is feeding more and more people. Efficient in terms of that individual farmer, but the small farmers, we've seen dairy farmer numbers halve since the mid-1990s. We've seen them fall by to about 25% of what they were since the 1970s. Those people who no longer can find a place in farming have drifted to the cities. Cities are getting bigger. The cities are needing more food to be taken to them, and all the problems of a dysfunctional food system simply get magnified.
4 minutes.
2 more minutes left. Four. Thank you. Mixed farming's been mentioned today, and I think that is a key aspect of all this, because there was a definite government policy to encourage farmers to specialise. When I got I was very lucky to get a tenancy of my first farm when I was 19, a 200-acre farm on the Cotswolds. I very quickly managed to rent another farm next door and was up to nearly 500 acres before very long. And I had a government small farm business scheme initially, which was actually conditional upon me getting rid of the 5 enterprises that my uncle had on that farm and taking it down to 1. They eventually compromised to 2, which was to have cattle on the banky ground and arable crops on the flatter fields. But I had to get rid of the chickens, the pigs and the vegetables, because that was actually a specific condition of the grant scheme. And maybe there's a bit of hope there, because that shows how agricultural policy influenced what the whole generation of farmers that I'm part of have done over the last 40 or 50 years. And therefore agricultural policy, if it was more enlightened, could make a big change. Another big issue is that we've seen the transition from, along with specialisation, Helen mentioned her farm staff, but when you have big arable farms, 1 man on a very large tractor can do the work of 20 men today. And if you have a very highly intensive livestock system, someone pushing buttons can do the work of a lot of individual people. And so we've moved from full-time farm workers to a greater demand for seasonal workers and for people working in the gig economy on contract. And that, of course, is bringing other problems for society. We've got a lot of resistance to people coming in, a lot of people who don't like so many other people coming in from countries into their areas to pick fruit and things of that sort. Now, I'm just going to give a couple of hopeful thoughts to finish with. Someone, I think you might be here, Robert Craig, I said, what's the answer to all this, Robert? And he said, it's education. And clearly that is the key answer. This conference, I hope, will be a small part of the step in that direction. But there's another aspect, which is we're working on the sustainable food, which we call true cost accounting in food and farming. It's really taking the whole idea of the fact there is a lot of academic research out there which puts a financial cost on the negative externalities of farming. And scientists and economists have looked at things like the cost of water pollution, the cost of soil degradation, the cost of the greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. But they've not yet started to put costs on the social and cultural aspects as well, which really should be factored into the equation. And so I'd say, actually, my closing words are that really the final solution to this is that we actually have to fight economics with economics. The systems are claimed to be more economical, but that's only because of production to future generations, to the environment, and to us consumers in other ways. Through our taxes, we pay a very much larger amount of money towards agriculture in the form of VAT, income tax, even council taxes and so on. So that's my solution. Let's fight economics with economics. Thank you.
I don't think that's particularly controversial. Actually, I think that
it's the quantity, it's the amount, not just the timing.
Yeah, And I think that the amount is probably the question. I think the public money for public goods and seeing that, I mean, I would really like to raise a question as to whether animal welfare is a private benefit rather than a public good. But I mean, I genuinely, because I think that there are some public goods that come out of higher welfare systems, and I think that it's, you know, animal welfare has never been included in that whole matrix of sustainability in the way that I think it probably should be. But that aside, I think the wind is blowing in this direction, and I think that as long as enough people get behind it and keep government on course, the question is, can we actually go further, much further than we have done in the past, in terms of the level of support that will be given to trying to make sure those environmental goods are secured?
Does anyone else want to comment on that? I do, if I may, because I don't think it's entirely agreeable to me that food is a private matter left to the market, the forces of the market. What happens with that is what we've got, which is crap food being produced in a cheap, terrible way, denatured food that people buy. And I think there is the issue of food quality and health, that producers who try and use the ecosystem, the farm and their resources to produce that higher quality healthy food are at a disadvantage in a kind of free market. And I think Tracy raised this issue this morning as the question as to whether or not basic food production and the production of quality food for health should be a protected activity and should be in somehow way be taken out of the free market.
Thank you. I just want to add, I totally agree with your point, and I want to add two things. One is that we were fortunate to have the minister, one of the ministers from the last government, to come to our farm this year, and she held responsibility for rural employment at the time, and she said to me, you know, you seem to be creating cost here, and most of the farmers I talk to are looking to reduce their employment costs. And I said, but, you know, I was totally convinced that the way forward, or I am totally convinced the way forward for our farm is to create diversity for humans as well as plants and animals. And I just feel really strongly that the farm should be a really vibrant place, and you need to, and as the gentleman suggested, you need to encourage people on. Yes, they're difficult to find, but in our case, with our bee enterprise, with our orchard, as two examples, in fact, with our sheep, we are creating, albeit part-time jobs. They're not temporary. They don't employ people for a 40-hour week, but they do provide interest. They provide a limited income, and they certainly provide the diversity on the farm that we wouldn't otherwise have. And we cannot, and I speak really as a small farmer, but representing tens of thousands of other small farmers when I say, you know, we know in the current economic environment on a farm you can't employ a lot of people, it's obvious. However, people do want to engage with natural environments, and as a number of people have already suggested, that's a really valuable thing to do. So I don't really see, I mean, we need to be creative. Yes, it is difficult, but it's possible. It should be really vibrant out on farms. It shouldn't be for one person to live on their own in isolation.
Well, only just briefly. I mean, I think there are quite a lot of opportunities on farms. But it is quite hard to find people who can really get their act together. There is a real challenge around that. And there's no doubt that some of those kind of more complex systems that I'm referring to, and you were talking about the agroforestry systems, that kind of thing, the biggest unknown or the biggest constraint is how do we actually manage those complex systems? How do we harvest them? How do we deal with all that variety of product without the labour becoming a big problem? And somehow you need to get the economics of that stuff starting to work so that you can afford to pay people reasonably well to come and do those kind of jobs. But there is a real challenge still around the labour zone. One of the things I'm most proud of at Eastbrook is the fact that we do have 11 people employed on the farm and another 25 people involved in the village in the rest of our activities. That's one of the things I love. It's also our biggest headache, of course.
Thanks.
I'd like to make a couple of points. The first is in relation to what Helen was saying about the ecosystem being bigger than the farm and the social structure around it. It happens to to come into my possession recently an account of the way that farming was done up the valley here in the 1920s. And at that time, it was obviously very self-sufficient in all their food, and obviously organic as well, because there were no artificial inputs. And throughout the year, the farmers in the Upper Towie Valley had a system where they helped each other throughout the year, doing all the different tasks that would come up. And the biggest single, if you can put your finger on it, apart from the Green Revolution itself, but the biggest single piece of technology that stopped that happening was the baler. Because previously, they'd all come together and help each other collect all the hay up and do all that whole haymaking process. And as soon as the baler came in, that stopped, because they didn't need to do it. The second point I would like to make is really, I don't know how many of you in the room are aware that in Wales we have a system of one planet development. And one planet development was specifically introduced by Jane Davison. She's going to talk about it in a session this afternoon. But to let people live on open countryside land, provided that they did so in a certain way. Now, I'm a patron with Jane of the One Planet Council, which tries to encourage that kind of thing. And the data's now coming in, because being in train for about 6 years, the data's coming in on the productivity from the kind of systems that the people doing this are putting into practice on their land. They're basically practicing a form of forestry and agroecology, and making the land much more diverse. So if we look at Lammas in Pembrokeshire, which was a sheep farm, hill farm, supporting one family with subsidies, is now supporting 9 families, 9 households, and the productivity has increased by well over 600%. Now, a criteria of one planet development is you have to produce 65% of your own livelihood from land-based activities. So they have to do this, and then they have to run a business as well, selling their produce. So the One Planet Council has introduced a One Planet label, and that label then goes on the produce, and the produce goes to market, so that people can see that it's coming from a One Planet development. And the whole point of that is a marketing exercise to try to raise awareness and to get people to support this kind of agricultural development. And I really think that since Wales has a target to get to One Planet ecological footprint within about a generation, by the middle of the century, but has no idea of how to get there, then this is definitely the way forward.
Bring back the question is, we keep falling into talking about farms, and that still means, the farm as it is, whether or not we should be thinking about breaking farms down. I mean, how about, for example, socialisation of land or nationalisation of land that gets rid of farmers and then goes out to allow lots more people into the farm. But the other thing is also, it's not just training for farmers, it's also training for food processing and food in the local economy. Whether we can deal with that, whether that's part of the question. So there's a very specific question about would you or are you engaged in teaching people on your farms, or whether you think we can break it down any further, and indeed whether small farms or farms as a unit is a way looking forward of feeding people as opposed to industrialised systems.
Just referring to this issue, Tim, you raised about the productivity, because I think it does relate in here. Productivity, I don't think, is the problem. Our ability to produce food is not the challenge we face. It's always the challenge we're told we're facing, but it's not. It's the economics of doing it, and particularly the economics around labour of doing it at the moment. But that's the challenge. It's not that we can't feed people. I do think there's some real merit in thinking about how do we enable more people to have a real-life contact time with farms. So I love the idea of students having a gap year on farms, maybe earning some money so that before they go to university you could be squaring all sorts of circles. I really think there is some real merit in thinking about that. We could put them off for life. And if we didn't put them off, they'd be great, that would be good. And at least they'd appreciate, even if it's quite tough, where their food comes from and understand a bit more about it. So I do think that's something we should be pursuing. On the apprenticeship front, I've got one. I've always had some apprentices on the farm. It's not always easy. It is important to try and get the right material. And I think you need the right kind of enterprises to make the most use of people who are completely raw. If they haven't done anything at all, we're quite mechanised. We need, the agroforestry type thing is the area where you can do that best. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that always. Will we need loads more people to produce our food? I think it's a really interesting question. I think it will change at different rates in different places. I do think that robotics will take away, potentially, will maybe allow us in some circumstances to manage complexity better with much, much lower inputs. I don't think it's a sort of complete solution, but I do think that there are some interesting advents in there. And I do think we will also see some systems of producing food which are less land-based. I think some of the stuff around algae and fungi and stuff we're not here to talk about today will perhaps take some of the pressure off our land a little bit. But some people will hate that idea too. So I can't see that we're going to suddenly reverse urbanisation. What I do think we could have is a lot more people in urban environments producing more food within their own communities. I think taking the land into the city will probably be easier than taking people out of the city onto the farms.
In relation to the students issue, we have had students on our farm on placement. There are two problems really for us. One is I think that we're quite old-fashioned, mixed farmers, and neither my sister or I went to university or to agricultural college. We learnt in our own way from my father, from my grandfather, from my great-uncle, and from my ancestors going back over hundreds of years. And there's a bit of a mismatch between the students that are coming out. Some of them very keen and very able, but we're not quite the right farm for them. And I rather bemoan the fact that I can't find the sort of workers that I had when I started farming. People who actually, mostly boys who left school with good vocational skills, which were encouraged by the education system at that time. Give them a spade and they could dig a trench, show them a tractor, and they sort of instinctively knew how to rebuild the engine. They had a whole range of countryside skills which they'd learned intuitively within the community, and they were able to work hard. I think the problem is they're more with us than with the students, but that's our situation. So we're not against it, but we hasn't been totally successful what we've done so far. Just quickly on the productivity side and the population issue. I mean, I think there's a huge issue with water. Even if we can produce enough food to feed growing populations, I don't think we're going to have enough water to feed large numbers of people. And with climate change coming in, if we allow populations, people sort of accepting it's going to happen, we're going to, the United Nations is now predicting 11 billion by the end of the century. If we actually allow that to happen, and particularly if we allow it's not so much just the numbers of people, it's actually the populations of developing countries, which we've been told aren't a problem because we're educated and we're limiting our families. But every child that's born in a developed country is going to have a carbon footprint which is 20 or 30 times bigger than a child born in Africa. So I just think we haven't got the resources, and if we don't tackle that, in fact, everything else is going to be completely out of harmony. And somebody asked a question about what sort of farms and that sort of how it could be done. If you look at what's happening, if you look at what has happened in South America since about 1980 something or other, we've seen this huge increase in farm size. Something like 200,000 pastoralists and small mixed farmers were kicked off their lands because they've got no paper rights. They were the ones that moved into the Amazon and started to try to get some grazing land, and then they've been pushed out by big cattle corporations and so on since then. Farms now are huge in South America that are producing soybeans and maize and things of that sort, and sugar. And the same thing, I'm afraid, is starting to happen in Africa. And if you look at the development organisations that are almost encouraging this, there's a very logical argument, which is that so much food is wasted by small farmers because they don't have the storage, they can't keep vermin out and so on, therefore farms must get bigger. But of course, every time that happens, there's one family that ends up drifting to the fringes of some shanty town around a big urban area and creating bigger problems. So I don't know what the solution is there. And on the productivity side, one other point. We may, I think modern agriculture is actually reaching the limits of productivity. We've in some areas we've seen yields falling, particularly in India, where after the Green Revolution in some places because of soil degradation and so on. But it's not just people measure productivity in terms of volume. You've also got to think about nutrient quality. We're desperately short in the world now of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, just aren't enough to go round. Are we producing foods with less trace elements in them? I'd say it's highly likely that we're getting less selenium, less zinc in our food as a result of modern farming methods.
Thank you. There's probably not a great deal more to add, but I would like to say two things. Firstly, as far as taking on young people is concerned, I think certainly within our business, we take on people as interns normally, and sometimes they stay, sometimes they go. We expect them to go normally. So we're very happy to take people in, but I'm talking of my seed business, not the farm. The farm for me is very new, so in answer directly to your question, we're not taking on students because there is nobody there currently to train them as such. However, we are developing an educational centre and putting a huge resource into that, which will take a huge amount of time and money and also requires people. So we're deliberately creating an environment where people will be employed. As far as scale is concerned, I think I'd like to say that I think farms are often too large because there are not enough people employed on them. And whilst we are where we are, we can't change how we've got here, the context in which we're here, we all understand. But it's unlikely that most large farmers, I don't mean physically, I mean farming large areas of land, will get to all corners of their farms because they can't, they're too big. And my experience as a small farmer is that it's really difficult to get around 100 acres every day to see what's going on and to make those decisions, that art that people talk about in farming. So if you've got, 2,500 acres, I'm not picking a particular size, it's really difficult to see how you can touch every corner and get the most from it and understand the most from it. And as far as employment is concerned, it's not about land area. I employ 20 people on less than a 1 acre site in my seed business. So, it's not about employment and area of land, I don't think.
Yeah, well, I can't speak from the farm level, but I used to run an international agricultural company, and we used to have what we call cuddle overseas on farms. On the basis, we used to work with VSO, so the terms were the same, but they were actually working on commercial and getting commercial experience. I think I was talking the other day to one of a friendly farmer down in Kent who takes people from London, young people, regularly, and she was down there when Adam Horowitz, the poet, was there. He read his poems, and they wrote poems about the land, which was great. But that's what I would call the awareness side, which is different from the intern apprenticeship side, which is about getting people into agriculture. Listening to us talk today, I see things from very differently. I've never worked in this country, and we are probably less than 1% of the world's food produced in this country. And we have to realize that when we subsidize agriculture in this country, it affects the other countries. The effect of powdered milk, subsidized powdered milk on countries in the developing world has been absolutely devastating. And then 60% of the world's pigs are in China. A third of the world's cows are in India. So we also need to be thinking about the impact on the rest of the world, and with Brexit, God help us, and these trade deals that are proposed, the impact on the developing world, I think, could be very, very serious. I'd just like to close with one thing to show how crazy agriculture is, and how I believe that we already produce enough food for 14 billion people. I could give you the figures if you wanted it. I worked a lot in Swaziland. My first job was teaching agriculture there, way back in 1968, the day after independence. There were 95,000 hectares of irrigated land. 85% of that produces sugar. Most of that sugar goes to produce Coca-Cola syrup. 50% of the rural farmers in Swaziland are on food aid. So there are, there's so much that we can do, but there are these fundamentals which distort the way, what it is that we can do.
Some of the things that have emerged in this discussion, I think first of all, what we need to take from this is that there's no one set. There's no one ecosystem, there's no one entity. I mean, John showed pictures of pasture, called him pasture, but those pictures were very different. I mean, some of those systems were carbon sequestration in that they were grass beginning to grow, others were more wetland areas, which are probably almost certainly not sequestering carbon any longer, they're a carbon store. Agroforestry systems, again, a different kind of dynamic. So we must get away from. One thing that we have to do with this conference and all discussions of future farming is get away from cliche and sloppy thinking. I've been doing this since 1976 in this world, and I'll tell you, I am really fed up with hearing the same headline cliches again and again and again, and we never really get below that. And we have to stop with the sloppy thinking and start with some serious thinking and also with some honesty about the kinds of things that we're doing. And one of the honesty things is to realize that ecosystems or whole systems are let's just use the jargon, socio-economic systems as well as ecosystems. Whether ecosystems on a farm level or a landscape level or indeed on a supply chain level, they involve people. There's that human ecology. When we use this term socio-economic, which is a kind of nice academic term, actually what we should be talking about is equity. We should be talking about people as a community. We should be talking about fair for everybody right within that supply chain. And that means moving away from agricultural systems that pay people that's basic slave labour. I know an academic who talks about modern peasantry. I mean, he's never been a peasant. Anytime real peasants get a chance to move out of peasantry, they move out of it because it's a difficult position and a difficult job. Maybe technology like robotics will help with that, but there's no point looking at these solutions without looking at the social structures. And one of my problems I thought the discussion this morning on the circular economy was great, it's wonderful, except for the fact it doesn't challenge the structures. We can do all the recycling in the world, we can do everything, but unless we change this basic, fundamentally inequitable system, the structures, we're still in the shit. Except some people are deeper in the shit than we are. And these are the people that John's talking about. So trade deals, where farm subsidies and trade deals punish people elsewhere in the world. On the other hand, I think people working on the land, people working on food production in this country need to be paid fairly. And the market isn't going to do that. There's no way that this market's going to do that. So we can't talk about harmony and natural cycles unless actually we talk about harmony within the economic system and really challenge those structures. And I don't think we're really asking the right kinds of questions in that area. But that then does lead us to, again within the harmony, what is the food production system? What is the environmental management system? I don't believe it can be this classic farm anymore, but I'm not sure where the boundary or the scope is. Whether Helen mentioned landscape level, but it could also be the food supply, food system level. And I think we certainly, if we're talking about feeding the world equitably and fairly and healthily, we wouldn't start from where we are. We are where we are, but we certainly wouldn't design a system where we have land ownership that's passed on and on and on, and there's a kind of elitist corporation, the system that we've got, which doesn't allow people to get in. We wouldn't have this system. We wouldn't start. But we are where we are. However, but I think we do have to be more imaginative in how we move forward. And the disappointment for me in the post-Brexit debate is that not enough people from alternatives and with a radical view are actually radically challenging and coming with new discussion. Even discussions about public goods for public money for public goods. That still doesn't challenge the structures. And even if we have adequate payment, it will not move us forward to a more balanced and harmonious system.